All right, everybody, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the Student Support Summit so far. We have some great sessions available for the rest of the day, including this exciting keynote by Dr. LaKeitha Poole. So Dr. LaKeitha Poole serves as the Associate Athletic Director and Director of Sports Psychology and Counseling Services here at LSU. She's a licensed professional counselor. Dr. Poole has worked with student athletes, Olympians, and professionals championing mental health and performance. Her leadership at LSU has been pivotal in developing comprehensive support that addresses the holistic needs of student athletes. As we delve into strategies to go all in for students' well-being, Dr. Poole's insights are both timely and invaluable. Please welcome Dr. Poole.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kemp. I'm so excited about getting to do this with you all today and be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can just switch over modes, and hopefully you all can still see me and hear me and then see that as well. Like I said, it's an honor to be here. As somebody who's been around LSU for a good bit of time, I am super familiar with the Student Success Summit, so I'm excited about just getting to be invited to be a part of this. And so I know that we have a virtual room full of individuals who have careers grounded across areas, but they're all mostly centered in care, which is why I'm so excited about getting to have this conversation. So I know we have everything from academic advisors to mental health professionals to support staff and everything in between. But I like to be able to have these discussions with the people that I like to call architects of possibility, because that's what we all end up kind of being for students, particularly in my case, student athletes, but in many of y'all's cases as well. And so, before we dive in, I really want to just give us a second because I know we are in the afternoon portion of the day, and I am a mental health practitioner, and I believe in being able to give ourselves a second to just ground ourselves. As human beings, we often need that. We get in the flow and the rush of things. And it's also, I know it's Friday. I know that while we all are excited to be in a community of learning together, I know how my brain works, and I'm often thinking of where I currently am and also thinking of all the things that are happening, like while I'm not sitting at my desk checking emails and doing other things. And I'm sure you all are doing that too. So before we start, I want to invite everybody, just because it's the lunch hour time, and just I know you all have had a full morning already and still have more to go, just to dive in before and take a collective breath together. So I hope everybody can take a big inhale for me. Hold it for a couple seconds up top. And when you're ready, just a big exhale so that we can get into this topic together. Um, as we move into some discussions just around a lot of different activities, obviously, my topic in itself is one that I'm passionate about, but also as much as people maybe don't often consider themselves to be helping professionals in the mental health space or in the wellness space, you all are actually that. And so I want to at least give you maybe some tips and tools that can be helpful, maybe shift some mindsets in how we look at this particular generation of student, and how to work with them. And so my hope is that we can kind of do that together and then leave some time at the end, maybe for some discussion / questions, and we go from there. So you've taken your deep breath. And now I want you to think of, if you can, one student that you've worked with, maybe in the past year, who stood out to you for any particular reason. Maybe it's someone who challenged you as a professional. Maybe it's somebody who inspired you. Maybe they transformed the way that you show up in the world or even in the workplace. And so whatever that story is, or whatever that student's story is, I want you to kind of just hold on to that story as we move through our time together today. And we'll revisit that a little bit at the end. And so today my talk is just centered around one that's a bit of a mouthful, and I also know it can be challenging just in name itself, and the idea of centering wellness and student success, but also figuring out how to foster what the sort of inclusive part of that is social emotional inclusivity and embracing intersectionality around centering wellness. And so at its core, what we're really talking about is belonging. And so that's what I kind of want to maybe make sure that, even though we're talking about centering wellness, we're talking about how belonging is used as a tool to create that wellness. And that's kind of going to guide our discussion today. So just to get us going a little bit, and again, I have these slides so that people can follow along, but I honestly just want to talk to you all today, and be able to help you just think a little bit differently. Starting out just to talk about the power of social and emotional inclusivity a little bit, and to be able to give a little bit of space to understanding how do we create those spaces where students, especially those who are most marginalized, or maybe they have certain social emotional issues, how do we give them space to be able to thrive? And so that's where emotional well-being is valued as much as their GPA is, or their ability to perform in the sport world and arena. And so the goal is for us in our roles, no matter what that role is to actually figure out where their identity can be something that it's not having to be hidden, right? And something that is actually honored and celebrated, because when we get that version of them, we get the best of them in the classroom, we get the best of them in whatever their other pursuits are. And so the first kind of objective in thinking about that and how we do that and the power behind social and emotional wellness is really just understanding the link between psychological safety and student engagement. When students feel safe, just like us as humans and as working professionals, when people feel safe, they are able to show up as their full selves. Now, we all know that there's diversity among students for different reasons. And so that ability to show up as your full self might be based on being neurodivergent. It could be based on being a first generation student. It could be based on being an immigrant, a religious affiliation. And so what we know though is that when they feel safe to show up as their full selves, they perform better academically. And so they also seek help more easily. That's, on our end, on the mental health side, we notice that they trust more easily. And so when we know that trust is a part of the conversation, which again goes to that idea of centering wellness, it changes everything. It actually allows an interaction to become a little bit more than just you trying to make sure that a student gets an assignment done or passes a class or performs better in their court of play, to really feeling embraced by the community that they're a part of at their particular university or in their school setting. And so being able to kind of think about what that looks like is important. And so take away from this idea around social emotional inclusivity, I really want people to think about how can you use those first interactions with a student to actually set a tone of acceptance. And so I put up here sort of a tip and something that I utilize when I'm talking to students or people that I'm meeting for the first time in general to make them feel welcomed, is being able to help people recognize like you don't have to be anything other than yourself here. And so creating a space for that is literally setting that tone of acceptance, which allows psychological safety to then become the priority, which we know we don't have time to get in Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all those things, but that's a huge part of how you are able to make a connection and really embrace social and emotional inclusivity in spaces where students need that in order to thrive. And so the other piece of that, though, is really being able to understand and to learn, and this is kind of tips for us, is to learn how to have emotional inclusivity be something that can foster both resilience and retention. So again, we go in from meeting that person and making that connection to then being able to keep them and have them thrive through these systems that they're a part of. And we're going to talk about systems a little bit too, a little later. But if a student's identity, let's say in the classroom, is excluded in some way, or maybe in an advising space, or maybe in their res hall or on their sports team, they internalize that. And so there's this sense of exclusion that now is tied to trauma. And so when that happens, we often forget that we too need to then recognize and kind of reflect back those spaces where humanity has kind of been left out of their experiences. Particularly as students, they're kind of cycling through all these experiences every day, all the time, and being able to kind of sort of upset those narratives is important, particularly before they start to internalize that. And so that objective that I have up here about emotional inclusivity, building that resilience, is really centered around being able to figure out how do we recognize and reflect that humanity back while we build protective factors around them. And those protective factors too is more of what we're going to talk about. And we actually serve as protective factors for them, both for their wellness, but also in their identity and their growth development. So another area of like, how do we kind of do this is we have to recognize that if we're kind of figuring out the space where wellness resides in them or centering that, particularly with social and emotional learning or social and emotional growth, we have to embrace sort of the intersectionality of what that looks like. And so I want to talk about intersectionality a little bit. I know most people probably are familiar with the term. It definitely over the years has now become a little bit more of a buzzword, which in some ways I'm okay with, but I also think, it matters how we use it, and it matters in how we actually conceptualize it to then apply it. But intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. Like I mentioned, it's become a bit of a buzzword, but at its heart, it really is an invitation in. It's an invitation to look deeper at people. It's an invitation to be able to see layers of who we are as humans. And so our objective around embracing intersectionality, the first one is centered around acknowledging how these overlapping identities might shape a student experience. And so remember, I hope you still keeping in mind that student that I mentioned earlier that I want you to think about throughout this whole talk. But imagine, a student's challenges being much deeper than their GPA, or much deeper than the issue they had in the res hall, or much deeper than them being late to, a practice or a lift. There's usually more there. And so I'll give you all an example, kind of a identity group to be able to consider when you were talking about how student athletes' challenges might be much deeper than their GPA. So imagine, in particular, a Black queer student that doesn't necessarily only experience maybe homophobia on one day, and then on the other day, because their identity is tied to their race, it's racism on another day. That's not actually what intersectionality is, but that's how we tend to almost think about it. Like on this day, maybe they're dealing with this, and on this day, they're dealing with that. Those experiences, those identities, being Black and queer in this example, those experiences happen simultaneously. So they have to show up in that way every single day, which then also means those experiences happen systemically, right? So like as our supports for them have to be applied, whether that's on the mental health side, on academic support, we have to think about all of those pieces being addressed or being served, and not just parts of them in sort of silos. And so a story that I kind of want to share a little bit more, because that was more of an example in the counseling and mental health space, because that's the space I occupy most. But I want to tell you about sort of a combined case of student athletes that I've worked with over the years and make it into one. So imagine we have this student athlete. They're struggling academically. Maybe they're skipping tutoring, they're late for class, or they're not going to class. And at some point, someone steps in, whether that's a professor or an academic advisor, who notices, and they assume that this is automatically a disciplinary issue. And so at a certain point, maybe that academic advisor tries to address that with them, talks about it, sits with them, and then finds a way to at least work in getting them over to us in mental health. And so then when I get to sit with them, it might be a student I've never met before. Maybe they're not on one of the teams that I have, that I serve as a liaison on. And so I'm just getting to know them, my first time ever seeing this person. During that conversation, I learn a bunch of things because I allow myself to be able to let their identity shape my experience with them, who they showed up as that day when they walked into my office. We went from there. And so maybe in that conversation, I learned their family's facing food insecurity. And so, instead of going to class, they're somehow trying to figure out how to make extra money from their scholarship money because they're selling their tennis shoes, or they're figuring out, this other way to send money home. Maybe they're managing a huge bout with anxiety because they got a new roommate, and the roommate is dating someone, and that person and them don't get along very well, and don't feel like they can be themselves around. Maybe they're functioning in an environment where their identity is seemingly the only one of its kind on their team. And so now they feel like maybe they're navigating some form of like code switching, maybe not just in their language, but even how they have to show up, how they have to dress, and that sort of thing. And so they didn't necessarily need, in that case, like this person who, again, it starts out with them struggling academically. Well, they don't need a tutor at that moment. They need sort of some type of trauma-informed plan, right? And some form of care for them. And so that might include on the academic side, having them understand what it looks like for them to create a quiet study space over in the space where they occupy most. Like for us in our academic center here, or we have spaces over in the mental health area where people can kind of like, utilize the study or just ground themselves. And the biggest piece though that they need in that moment is actually one adult who isn't questioning their worth based on the fact that they've been missing class, they're missing tutoring, they're late. And so being able to kind of like start to navigate this idea of these overlapping identities start to shape these experiences, we really then have to figure out how to integrate more social emotional responses and practices into the systems that we all manage and run for them. And so this might mean a couple different things, and I'm going to toss out some examples, but I hope that maybe some of our discussion and questions will bring up more of these that I'm not even thinking about. But this might mean everything from offering mental health resources that reflect social emotional values. And so, I know we're really fortunate here at LSU that our mental health services and our performance services are built right into our department. But every school's structure isn't like that. And so figuring out how do you then offer that resource just so that it's reflected in that our university or our department cares about this for you. Another way I think is reimagining what advising offices look like when it comes to using proper language or making sure that representation is very present and understood and welcomed and embraced. And then even like the simple logistical things, right, that we don't think about. And I know we're in a time of change in a lot of ways, but really making sure that even like the formality of like the types of forms we use, the types of platforms we use, technology versus paper, those things also help to honor people's identities in different ways, their learning identities, their cultural identities, their ethnic identities. And so just figuring out what that looks like, I think, is a huge part and why embracing this idea of intersectionality is pretty critical. So when we start thinking now, I mentioned this earlier, like about the systems, it really is us now thinking, okay, well, what does creating these systems look like in action and in real form if they're both wellness centered and also inclusive? And so what we learn usually when we go to conferences like this or have discussions like this, we end up, leaving thinking like, oh my goodness, I have to change either everything, or we feel like, okay, we're doing a good job, but where are we missing the mark and needing to maybe follow up and still make revisions to change in our processes. And so we can talk, theory all day about this, from learning theories to mental health theories. But what does that actually look like in real time and kind of as the folks who are kind of the boots on the ground? And that really includes being able to make some system shifts. And so part of what this looks like, and again, I gave examples here and I'm going to talk through some of them, but there may be other ways that you in your particular role can have that influence in shifting the systems related to like creating these wellness centered spaces. And so on the academic side, again, kind of like our example, this may just look like having a lot of flexibility. But one of the things that I really enjoy like telling our academic folks here about is like find ways just to create ways to check in on how somebody's belonging feels. And of course, generationally, they all have different words and ways that they express like I'm good or I'm doing okay. And it's kind of on us to keep up with that. I hate that actually because it feel like it changed all the time and it's very much based on social media. But really being able to figure out like how can I offer flexibility? Maybe you are scheduled to have an academic meeting with them and they have a pretty tight class schedule. And while meeting in person does create a totally different bond and rapport, maybe offering them the flexibility to have their quick 15-minute meeting with you on Zoom so that they don't have to walk all the way from their class over to where your space is and then back to their class that's actually on the other side of campus, which decreases their stress, helps them to be more aware of actually how they're feeling about managing their schedule in their life. And then it just helps us kind of avoid some of the things that end up being barriers to them that we don't think about in terms of their day to day, but that often they're experiencing and they don't know how to express to us. I think also like in the academic space, a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this and have had to work really hard at it, but a lot of times we have to avoid assuming students know institutional just jargon. Like they know that they have an advisor that helps them schedule their classes. They have a counselor that helps them manage their life. They have a coach that tells them what time they need to wake up in the morning and show up. And like their lives tend to be a little bit more compartmentalized than we think because that exists outside of all of us. And so this belonging check really helps give space to be able to think about maybe at a time like midterms or peak moments in their seasons, to be able to just one-on-one have a way to make that student know that somebody cares about how they actually feel about being on campus. So it's not necessarily about, how their sports going or even how specific classes are going, but like the belonging check is about the feeling, like what are they carrying every single day? And then you can kind of know, well, how's that getting in the way of their academic pursuits or their ability to stay, focused or whatever that is. And so, from the academic perspective, that's one of the ways that I like to think about that a lot. On the mental health side, I mean, I think that looks like making sure that you have a variety of folks available for them to choose from. Mental health is physical health, and so it's really important that people feel like they have the opportunity to get the type of care that they want, even if they're unfamiliar with what mental health services and resources look like. So for us, that looks like making sure that we hire a variety of different people. We try to make sure that we can create opportunities for maybe like drop-in wellness spaces. For us, a great example is this week is our Go Be Well week, which we did in collaboration with our Tiger Life kind of life skills program. Just being able to bring general awareness to like taking care of yourself while also celebrating Student Athlete Appreciation Week and letting them know we care about them, we love what they do, we want to support them in every possible way we can. While also just having them understand like how to have some rooted, grounded techniques and tools to check in with themselves on their well-being. And so we also have like a mind room here. I kind of alluded to that earlier when I talked about spaces. We have a space where students can pop in there to do homework if they want. They can take a nap in there if they want to. We have meditation devices. We just got a massage chair in there that is very, very popular by both students and staff because I see the staff sneaking in there sometime, which I'm okay with. But just being able to recognize like those are also shifts that we can make. It isn't always as tough and about like the theory parts that we tend to think about. The last piece is just specifically, obviously, for athletics and thinking about what that looks like. But honestly, you could say athletics and then probably even other just student service areas. This looks like just integrating the whole idea of belonging into everything. And so that's inclusivity, that's the intersectionality things we've talked about. That's obviously what I always recommend when I have conversation with coaches or other administrators of just being able to think about, well, how are we creating either programs and support systems for those folks after they come off of, the field every Saturday night? Or how are we figuring out how to maybe pair those people with the other resources, which might be other people that they need to really create better lived experiences. And so I think about, for many of you all here at different schools and different roles, consider what does it look like to invest in the idea of if it's not you and your role to have somebody that you can bring in to discuss what does it look like to kind of elevate their lives when it comes to centering their wellness, when it comes to their mental performance, when it comes to the way in which maybe they're thinking about their transition out of sport or out of school, and being able to like let other people be a part of your village and a part of your system as well, because that also creates that shift that we're looking for. And so the objective there is really to figure out, well, how do I not just stay so stuck in this idea of like, oh man, I have all these changes to make, but instead to take a look at ourselves and figure out how do we commit to just being courageous institutionally. And so the term itself is called institutional courage. It's not just about inclusion. It's not just about making sure that there's a space there, but like, how do we find ways to challenge the system of what's in place and not in this like rebellious, wild way, but instead to just take a look at what's working and what's not working. A lot of times, again, we get caught up in the idea of inclusion being the kind of golden standard of how we make this all happen. But honestly, and I know again, we're in a time where that word can be seemingly triggering for people, but honestly, we're talking about accountability, right? And like, we don't want to just have sort of lip service in that we're willing to go the distance for our athletes or for our students. But we want to instead figure out, well, how do I show up as the person in the room who asks the right questions? And so that institutional courage for me or for my colleagues when I'm talking to them might be to ask themselves simple questions like, well, who's not represented here? We have leadership programs and things like that that we do, that when we get applicants and we start to look at who applied, and I noticed that like, okay, we have all these sports represented except men's tennis. Well, what's happening? Like, why is it men's tennis? Why don't we have one? Even though that's a small team, we should have one person that wanted to be a part of this or that wanted to at least ask about it. Other questions you might ask is like, how is maybe this policy that we've created now impacting students who don't look the same, maybe on a singular team, but also across an athletics department. And so being able to just check your biases, like figure out where those blind spots are. We all have them, and they really do deter somebody from being able to exist in a well way, and as a way they like to say it, among their peers, when no one's actually asking these questions and really figuring out how to have that courage to create spaces that actually prioritize their well-being, but also prioritizes what experience they're having in the first place. So just to get us through to kind of like call to action and what does that look like? And then I want us to, again, be able to reflect a little bit more too, because I know I've talked at you a bit, but I want us to have a second to really think about like, how can we pause after kind of hearing this and thinking about maybe how we're doing things where we are, to just be real about the fact that like the work that everybody on this call and on and attending this conference does, it's real and it's hard. And like every single day, being able to know that like there are going to be some days where we get it wrong. There are definitely days where we have spent an entire day going through seeing students, working with teams, consulting with coaches, and I get to the end of the day and I'm still like, I don't know if I had the impact that I actually intended to. And it doesn't mean that I didn't, but there are just times where, as hard as we work, this work is still hard. And so that's kind of the point in actuality. And when we start thinking about centering wellness and creating spaces that are inclusive, you got to think of it more as like, a muscle. Right. It's being able to get stronger. You have to work it in order for it to work. It's not necessarily a milestone. And unfortunately, many of us, I've again been guilty of this, of thinking of like, okay, if we do this thing, we've met the standard, we've met the mark. Knowing that, generationally students will change, also knowing that systems will change, our society will change. And so you have to really think of how do you create spaces that function more like a muscle, to be built up, to be broken down at times, and then rebuilt up again, instead of them being sort of milestones or mile markers that you're kind of thinking through. And so, like I mentioned, this work is sacred. It's hard. You're going to get it wrong. You have to keep going. But to recognize that like all of us here also, we're not just advisors or mental health practitioners or paraprofessionals or student service workers. We're all sort of centered around being bridge builders. We are creating the connections for a lot of the students that we work with. And so we have to hold space for them. And holding space for them looks like seeing all of them. You have to know that our students want to feel seen, they want to feel heard, they want to feel held. And again, the bias in my experience is I get to have that automatically. If a student's coming over to LSU Sports Psych and Counseling, they're usually coming over because of some emotional thing that has happened. And so I don't have to do sort of the huge leg lift I feel like many of you all have to do of figuring out what's behind that behavior. And so my hope is that some of these conversations that we've had today or that we're thinking about today is really of like, well, how do I just build the bridge, either to get the person over to mental health, to help them get connected to another international student because they feel alone in their team, to be able to help them figure out if like home life is bleeding too much into their personal life here away at college. And so if you can, again, create space for students to feel seen, heard, and held, then you're doing the sacred work and you're trying to figure out just how to keep evolving in your own well-being and in your own professional growth at the same time. And so I want to invite you to think about, just a couple ways to be those bridge builders through some of these questions that you see up here, and like really thinking about for yourself, now that we've talked about and defined some of these, like where can you be more inclusive? And by inclusive, again, I mean emotionally inclusive. I just mean being able to see somebody for who they are, understand that we all mental health exists on a continuum for all of us, just like physical health. And so we all have that, and we all need to figure out what that is, but we also need people who consider it and who care about it. And so being able to figure out where can you be more emotionally inclusive, how can you honor intersectionality in the ways that you show up, right? So what do you have control over in your role to be able to see a student sitting in front of you in that way, your colleagues and your peers in front of you in a different way? And even when you go home, you know, everybody talks about like sort of that catchphrase of like practice makes perfect. We shouldn't necessarily be turning on and off like a light switch the way in which we see and connect with people. That's not wellness at all. And so I think being able to kind of make sure that you're always honoring intersectionality as a concept of how you want to move and navigate through your role is important. And then again, going back to our last discussion on the last slide is like, well, what systems do I have the power to shift? Oftentimes in work as helpers, we feel like we don't have a lot of power. This is where I always encourage people to figure out like, how aware are you of your influence? And believe it or not, we all have much more influence that we think, particularly in the lives of students. I know they don't always listen to us. I know they think we're old and we don't know anything. I know they feel like we, you know, have missed sort of the mark of like living our best lives, because they're in this era where it does seem like they get to do that in a different way because the landscape keeps changing. But honestly, it's really being able to kind of consider, well, where do I still have influence? And if I had to bet, if I was a betting woman, I definitely would tell you that if you can create the awareness of the influence that you have, then you have it. And there are ways for you to do that through your conversations with students, through your rapport that you build with them, even through the times where you do have to sort of in a role that might have to be a little bit more disciplinary in nature to get them to the stage for graduation, you still have an influence. And so being able to just think about what that is and where that comes from is important. Because ultimately what we know is that, you know, when we create a space for a whole student to show up, and, you know, the concept, we didn't have time to go into the idea of even holistic wellness in that way, but if a whole student is able to show up, we already are now creating a safe space for a better future for them in whatever way. We don't know what the journey is going to look like when they show up as that whole person freshman year and what it looks like by senior year, but we do know that we're committed to sort of the journey and the cause with them, and being able to see all of them and being able to create that better future that ultimately, yes, benefits them because it gets them to their next thing. But it actually makes for a better future for all of us, because they then go out into the world, and other people that we interact with and engage with, they end up being the teachers to our children, the doctors for our families. And so being able to sort of think about what that looks like for you, I invite you to, you know, consider yourself a bridge builder, but also ask yourself those questions so that you can think about what that really looks like. And so just to kind of like affirm some of the stuff that we've talked about and really just give us some reflection, I really want you to go back to, again, that either student that I mentioned, you putting in mind earlier, or maybe since having some of these kind of concepts and terms thrown at you that you've thought of even different students that you're working with even right now. But I want you to think about like, what's one change, just one that you can make, you know, to your own or to a student's sort of wellness practice. And again, wellness in this case, what we're talking about today as part of our theme is social emotional inclusivity. Like, how are we looking at the whole person? How are we driving care and self-care as a part of how we do our work? So I really want to encourage people to kind of really think about that. And similar to how we started our sort of conversation today, with a big deep breath and really giving us that room to just like calm ourselves. Another tool that we also use in the mental health space is being able to give people affirmations. And so it's always nice that in a space like this, where we know we're all here today because we care so much about students and we care so much about what we do, for us to collectively affirm ourselves. And so you don't necessarily have to use what you see up on your screen as the one to say, but I encourage everybody as we close to give yourself room to take another big deep breath and another big inhale and exhale, and really allow yourself to recognize and affirm for yourself that we create spaces where every identity matters and every story is sacred and every student belongs. And so being able to do that, if you do that, you are the best practitioner at what you do. And so I hope that if nothing else, whether it's thinking about a change you can make for yourself personally so you can show it better for your students, or being able to take tools from what you gain from everybody that you hear talk today, to maybe challenge your peers and colleagues, shake up some systems if you need to. I hope it elevates you to be able to feel like you can have a place in centering both wellness and social and emotional care into the work that you do, and really just be able to affirm how great of a job I know everybody here does, because you're here learning with each other for a reason. And so being able to be a part of that today, for you to pour into you in that way and help you think about that, has been absolutely my pleasure. And I hope that at least something I said maybe stands out to help you think differently, or just makes you feel good knowing that you're doing an awesome job. And so I appreciate all of you for listening to me. I tried to go as speedily as I can and use my New Orleans speed to get us through, because I know y'all got a lot going on, but also to give us a few minutes, I hope, just to be able to take questions if we have them and just go from there. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Dr. Kemp for, I guess, Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have some questions in the chat. First, from Mia, how do you define self-care? What spaces have you been in where you feel like all of your identity has been taken care of? And how do you find those spaces?
So self-care, it's funny because I always joke in our department or here at LSU that I am the bubble burster around what self-care is for people, because people will often use self-care as this sort of like checklist of like, oh, I did these things to sort of say that I did them. A lot of times we start defining self-care as these like wellness activities, which count, right? Like the getting your nails done, going get a massage, taking a walk. And those are actually self-care activities. But if you're not doing them with the consistency of being able to say that I have developed a routine around caring for myself, then you're actually practicing self-indulgence. And a lot of people hate when I say that, because I think they feel bad that and it's not that they're not practicing self-care. It's actually that you just have not developed true self-care routine as an internalized way of being. So my definition probably looks a little different than most people, because people will be saying, well, self-care is, it's self-defined, it's caring for yourself. And it's like, yes, but if you do that with no consistency, you're just indulging in activities to be able to tell people that you're taking care of yourself. And
Mhm.
so I think, that's important. The part about like spaces that I've been in where I feel like all of my identity has been taken care of, usually, and this, I would imagine students would say this too, but for myself personally, that looks like being around the places where my identity can be free. So I joked at the end there, like, I'm from New Orleans. Going home for me sets me free. Like, it just, I've lived in Baton Rouge for 15 years and I like it enough. So all my Baton Rouge folks who feel like I might be hating a little bit, I've obviously stuck around, so it's fine. But there's something for me about going home and going to French Quarter Fest, or walking in my mom's house, the house I grew up in, and went to high school from every day, and and rebuilt after Katrina. Like, there are things that make me. And so those spaces help me feel more like myself. And so what's cool about then knowing that I don't live in New Orleans, I live an hour away and here, and I spend the majority of my time here, then I have to figure out, how do I make those spaces? And so I think that's the other part of your question. It's like, you find them by figuring out, how do you create them? Do you create community among peers? Do you find ways to establish new hobbies? The number of things that I have tried since living in Baton Rouge, my family would probably never like think that I would. I've always been an introverted person. I'm pretty like low key. I like reading and I like naps. And so like being able to realize that, like, but that's a great example actually of like those types of activities, while they might restore me on a Friday afternoon after doing a keynote, they're not really self-care until I put that into practice often. And so what that looks like now for me as an employee is that I try to now, when I can, at least once a month, take a Friday off, and like I just give myself a long weekend. And I may not have anything in particular planned. I might stay home and end up washing my dishes because I didn't get them done all week, or cleaning up my whole house, or sweeping out my garage, or taking a drive. And so those are the ways I think you can create self-care. And then I use that same kind of methodology in encouraging students to think about that for themselves as well. Like, especially our student athletes, their lives look very structured already. They have schedules to keep, they have things to do. And oftentimes their identity gets pushed down. Not that it's dismissed, but just pushed down because they have so many other things. Where can you create spaces to do that? So I hope I answered all three of those parts.
Do we have any additional questions? We have a couple minutes left. Well, if there are no additional questions, I want to sincerely thank Dr. Poole for joining us this afternoon for our keynote. It was so insightful and allowed us time to be reflective about our work with students, but also just how we treat ourselves as well in the spaces where we work with our students and student athletes. So thank you. Oh, one more question. How do you deal with a student who doesn't respond well to harping on them?
I think to figure out how you're like utilizing the harping, right? Because I get it. We have those students that sometimes if someone doesn't sort of stay on top of them or give them that direction, they will stray, or they will kind of like, I don't know, go off into an end that we don't really want to see happen. But I think one of the ways to do that is, and kind of talked about this, but like this idea of just being able to figure out, well, what is it that like we haven't asked about them as the person? Because I'm sure like in your role, like you are likely doing everything that is required to make sure that they get whatever their duties are done, if it's academic, if it's social, if it's whatever. And sometimes we're just missing like that thing that we secretly didn't know that they love. And sometimes it's a secret passion or a hobby. Sometimes it's a connection to family. They just don't talk about family a lot. And so instead, I encourage people like change the harping instead to just get curious, like get curious about them. In most cases, I know students of this generation, they are so different. I don't like calling them weird, but like a form of me wants to, because like they're just so different. And they are harder to connect with. And so I think your harping is fine if it starts to create curiosity, and they actually respond really well to feeling like people want to know about them. And I have so many examples of students that I have never worked with because maybe they're not on any of the teams that I have, but my office is in the space in the training room where I see them all day, every day, and I might not know them and they might not know me. But as I walk out the door to go home for the day with my lunch bag and my backpack, and like I see them wearing something cool on their boot that they're injured from, or a jersey on that's not for their team, it's from like an international team or something like that. Use that to get curious about them, those moments, so that the in between, when you do have to get on them, they don't take it wrong because they now trust you. And that goes back to that point earlier I mentioned, like trust ends up being the bridge connector. And a lot of times, they don't see it until they realize like, oh, this person really wants to know me. So I know it's not like the golden key to make every student kind of like bend to your will around what you need them to do. But they all seem to love the concept of like people being curious about them. They live in a world where social media is their go-to of like letting people, they tell everybody everything. And so I think recognizing that for us, we often don't exist in that world for them. We don't, our job in particular, we don't follow students on purpose on social media. So I don't care, even when they graduate, I don't want to know, because at that point they've worn me out. And so being able to kind of get curious about like the person, I think that helps. And if you do that in between, I think it makes the harping a little bit easier. They take it a little bit better. They still may not like it, but they respect you and they trust you. And it makes it much easier to give that feedback when you need to.
Well, thank you.
Mhm.
And thank you for your questions.
Yeah.
Not seeing any additional questions. So once again, Dr. Poole, thank you so much for your time. Very insightful presentation, and we definitely got a lot out of it. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll be heading into the next sessions at 1:30. So enjoy the rest of Student Support Summit.